there's a new ceasefire deal on the table between Russia and Ukraine.
The Trump administration announced Russia and Ukraine agreed to stop fighting in the Black Sea after marathon negotiations in Saudi Arabia. But soon after the White House announced the plan, the Kremlin said the deal would only proceed if a few more conditions were met first.
Details on this limited pause on fighting are still being hashed out. But when it comes to actually bringing an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine, Russian President Vladimir Putin must believe that he's playing US President Donald Trump like a fiddle. Because in spite of his promises, the reality is that he's blackmailing Trump with his Black Sea ceasefire. History has shown that Russia's leader has no intention of following through on any of these promises. But what Putin doesn't know is that the rest of the world already sees through his game. And the US, Ukraine, and all of Ukraine's allies know that Vladimir is bound to go back on the deal. On March 25, the BBC reported that Russia and Ukraine had agreed to a naval ceasefire in the Black Sea. That agreement came on the back of a meeting between what the White House dubs expert groups in Saudi Arabia. Those groups, one each representing Trump and Putin, took part in bilateral technical talks that focused on multiple Black Sea issues. Securing safe navigation and eliminating the use of force against commercial vessels for military purposes was high on the US agenda. So too were discussions about a previous ceasefire Putin promised, this one focusing on attacks on energy infrastructure. The meeting seemed to have gone well, and in its wake the US claimed that all parties, itself, Ukraine and Russia, were working toward a durable and lasting peace. It also suggested that the negotiations would reopen a valuable trade route, enabling both Russian and Ukrainian exporters to ship their products, especially grain, via the Black Sea for as long as the ceasefire was in place. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is already cautious about this deal. While he praised these ceasefire discussions, noting that the US was holding the right meetings, making the right decisions, taking the right steps, Zelenskyy also observed that it's too early to say that it will work. He added, "No one can accuse Ukraine of not moving towards a sustainable peace after this," Ukraine's president added. Looking between the lines, Zelenskyy's implications were clear. Though he hoped that Putin would stick to his word about the Black Sea ceasefire, he doesn't think that he will. It's too early to say. Translates to Putin isn't a man of his word and will try to use this deal to get more from Ukraine and the US while Russia continues its war. No sooner had Zelenskyy made this statement than the reports started circulating. What the US and Russia discussed during the Saudi Arabia meeting wasn't enough. Putin wanted more, and he was willing to blackmail Trump to get it. Shortly after Trump announced the outcome of the meeting, the Kremlin essentially put the kibosh on the whole Black Sea ceasefire. It would only agree to such a motion if and when sanctions were lifted against Russian banks, along with its producers and exporters involved in the fertilizer and food trades. Russia's new demands included reinstituting Russia's banks to the SWIFT pay system, a ban implemented near the beginning of Putin's Ukraine invasion, along with lifting the restrictions against many commercial ships flying the Russian flag. It's obvious why Putin wants these sanctions lifted. Right now, the US and many of its allies in Europe, Asia and Australasia have combined to implement 21,692 sanctions against Russia since February 2022. Over 8,000 of those sanctions target Russian entities, such as banks and companies. Those 21,692 sanctions add to the 2,619 that were already in place before Putin launched his invasion, making Russia the most sanctioned country in the world. For context, Iran comes second with 5,475 sanctions, just over a fifth of the number Russia has. Those sanctions have been effective. In February 2024, the US claimed that sanctions against Russia already cut 5% from the economic growth Russia might have experienced during the first 2 years of the Ukraine invasion. Many in the international community have stopped trading with Russia, costing the country billions of dollars Putin could have used to fund his war machine. And therein lies the blackmail. Putin worked with Trump to get an agreement on the table. At the time, that agreement seemed sound. Ukraine and Russia would both stop their military attacks in the Black Sea. But as soon as the US confirmed that deal, Putin went back on his word. He knows how much Trump wants to achieve peace in Ukraine. Trump himself boasted he would end the war within 24 hours after taking office, claims he since said were sarcastic, but revealed that he wants to be known as the man who brought this entire crisis to an end. Playing on that fact, Putin has changed the Black Sea game. Trump can still have a ceasefire, Putin is saying, but to get it, the US and its allies have to lift hundreds, perhaps even thousands of sanctions placed against Russia. Putin is attempting to create a win-win situation for itself here. If the US says no to lifting any sanctions, Russia's leader can claim he tried to negotiate peace and the other side didn't. He would have a propaganda victory, however hollow it might be anywhere but in Russia, and can continue his Ukraine invasion. However, if the US does agree to lift sanctions, that opens the door for billions of dollars of cash to come flooding back into Russia. Putin gets to crop up Russia's ailing economy, all without having made any promises to end the Ukraine war. He'd essentially give up the Black Sea, likely temporarily, so that he could carry on funding his war machine. Again, the invasion wouldn't stop. Russia would just be in a better financial position to continue the supposed special military operation. There's just one problem for Putin. Zelenskyy saw all of this coming, and worse yet for Russia's leader, it appears that Trump is also becoming aware of the tactics Russia's leader is trying to use to get what he wants. Ukraine has already accused Putin of lying about how the Black Sea ceasefire is conditional on sanctions being lifted. The country's defense minister, Rustem Umerov, has already shot back, saying that third countries could oversee the ceasefire. He's also sent a warning to Putin. If Ukraine sees any warships beyond the eastern part of the Black Sea, those sightings will be treated as a threat to Ukraine's national security. In this case, Ukraine will have full right to exercise the right to self-defense, Umerov said. Translation: Ukraine already knows you'll break this ceasefire, and it's letting everybody know that it's prepared. Per MSNBC, Trump was a little more subdued in the wake of Putin's last-minute demand when quizzed about Putin's sanction demands by reporters.
Sir, on the Black Sea, so the Kremlin has said that there were several conditions that would need to be met for this agreement to happen. This includes sanction relief for banks and some companies. Did the U.S. agree to all of those conditions that they laid out?
They will be looking at them, and we're thinking about all of them right now. There are about 5 or 6 conditions. We're looking at all of them.
However, as a negotiator in his own right, he seems to understand what Putin is trying to do. Asked by Newsmax if he felt that Putin was stalling, Trump repeated his claim that Russia wants to see an end to the war.
But it could be they're dragging their feet. I've done it over the years. I don't want to sign a contract. I want to sort of stay in the game, but maybe I don't want to do it quite. I'm not sure.
Trump was perhaps being diplomatic, but it reveals that he knows what Putin is trying to pull. He knows that Russia's leader doesn't want to do the deal that he negotiated with the US. He wants more. And if he gets a suspension of sanctions, along with his requests related to food and fertilizer products, what's to stop him from asking for even more after that? The blackmail attempt is already well underway, but it seems like neither Zelenskyy nor Trump are willing to give in to Putin's demands this time around. Why would they? Both know, whether they outright say it or not, that Putin is going to betray the Black Sea ceasefire deal sooner or later. How do they know? We can start with the fact that Putin has already gone back on his word relating to a Black Sea deal once already during his Ukraine invasion. The BBC highlights this in its report on the ceasefire, noting that Ukraine and Russia agreed on an arrangement in 2022 that would ensure the safe passage of commercial ships through the Black Sea, much like the one Putin initially agreed to with Trump. Dubbed the Black Sea Grain Deal, it promised to allow Ukraine's commercial grain ships to pass through the Black Sea without facing any military attacks by Russia. Initially put in place for 120 days following Putin's invasion, the deal saw multiple extensions, until Putin did what he's trying to do with his most recent ceasefire. He pulled out. In July 2023, Russia claimed that key parts of the initial agreement hadn't been implemented, leading to it ending the whole thing. Kremlin mouthpiece Dmitry Peskov even brought that failed deal up while Putin's representatives were talking about this latest ceasefire with Trump's team. But if you remember the initiative in its previous form, there was quite a large part of the obligations to our country that were not fulfilled last time, claims Peskov. Therefore, this will also be on the agenda today. As for what those issues were, Russia claimed at the time that it faced serious obstacles getting its own food and fertilizer through the Black Sea in 2022 and 2023. Interestingly, that claim doesn't quite gel with the fact that it had no issues, and still has no issues, transporting its grain via the same waterway. It all adds up to excuses from Russia. And the reality is that Putin wanted to renege on the original Black Sea deal because he wanted to keep the waterway clear for his warships. There's every reason for Trump and Zelenskyy to believe he'll do the same again, as the deal proposed right now is basically the same as the one created in 2022. Only now, Putin is trying to blackmail the US to get more out of it. But maybe things are different this time around. It's been almost 2 years since Putin broke off the initial Black Sea ceasefire. Maybe he does actually want a ceasefire this time around. The problem with that line of thinking, though, is that Putin has already broken another ceasefire in far more recent memory. During Putin's March 18th phone call with Trump, Russia's leader said that he would implement an immediate ceasefire on all Ukrainian energy infrastructure if Ukraine did the same for Russia's energy and oil industries. Both countries have felt the weight of these types of attacks. By February 2025, Ukrainian energy infrastructure losses amounted to $14.6 billion. Ukraine's counterattacks against Russia's oil refineries have been just as costly to Putin, disrupting 17% of Putin's refining capacity by the same month. Putin's proposal seemed to make sense on both sides, leading to Ukraine accepting it. But within hours of Putin hanging up the phone, he ordered a swarm of 40 drones targeting civilian and energy infrastructure. It's these types of nighttime attacks by Russia that destroy our energy sector, our infrastructure, and the normal life of Ukrainians, said Zelenskyy. Today, Putin effectively rejected the proposal for a full ceasefire. He also seemed to reject his own proposal for an energy-related ceasefire, as the Russian strike came despite the Kremlin's claims that Putin had ordered an immediate halt to energy infrastructure attacks. Ukraine responded by sending its drones to Krasnodar, sparking a fire at an oil depot in the region. Right now, Ukraine and Russia are negotiating with the US on the technicalities of an energy infrastructure ceasefire that was meant to be immediate. That's just another example of Putin dragging his feet on a deal that he doesn't want to make. Trump and Zelenskyy are also likely aware of Putin's long history of breaking peace and ceasefire agreements. That's according to The Independent, which also reported on Putin's immediate breaking of the energy infrastructure ceasefire he negotiated. It points out that Putin has both helped to create and ultimately broken a shocking 25 peace agreement since he started his campaign of aggression against Ukraine in 2014. The Minsk Agreement is a perfect example. Following Putin's 2014 invasion of Ukraine, in which he leveraged pro-Russian separatist movements in Luhansk and Donetsk to cause havoc in the country, he signed 2 agreements with his enemy. On September 5, 2014, the first of those agreements was ratified. It promised the withdrawal of heavy weapons, a prisoner exchange, and the delivery of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. A day later, Russian troops fired on Ukrainian positions, using heavy weapons at least 10 times. A second Minsk agreement, this time negotiated for former French President François Hollande and ex-German Chancellor Angela Merkel, was put in place on February 15, 2015. This time, Putin barely waited for the ink to dry on that deal. Within minutes of the ceasefire going into effect, Russian soldiers fired on a Ukrainian checkpoint in Luhansk. Either there was serious miscommunication going on in the Russian ranks, or Putin was establishing a pattern. Since the 2 broken Minsk agreements, Putin has gone back on his word time and time again. Ukraine and Russia agreed on ceasefires over Christmas, Easter, and several other holidays in the 4 years that followed the start of Putin's 2014 campaign of aggression. Practically all were broken. When Zelenskyy became Ukraine's president, he met with Putin for multiple rounds of peace talks, including one that promised the disengagement of military forces in 3 Ukrainian regions by March 2020. Nothing came of those talks. Fighting continued, despite Putin agreeing he'd stop. And even if Russia hadn't broken those ceasefires so soon after agreeing to them, Putin put any peace agreement in the ground when he invaded Ukraine in February 2022. The point here is that Ukraine has seen all of this before, where Putin makes a promise and then immediately breaks it. The blackmail tactics Russia's leader is now attempting to use against Trump show that nothing has changed. So why is Putin trying to blackmail Trump right now? Because Putin genuinely wants the sanctions placed against Russia to be lifted, and he feels that the Black Sea ceasefire gives him the leverage to make that happen. As the Carnegie Endowment puts it, Russia's economy between December 2022 and December 2024 has operated like a marathoner on fiscal steroids, and now those steroids are wearing off. Putin and his people are collectively feeling the sting of 3 years of massive sanctions, and he either gets them lifted or he gets an excuse to keep the Ukraine war going. But it all runs deeper than that. Take the setting of the latest ceasefire as an example. The Black Sea was supposed to be one of Russia's big advantages in the Ukraine invasion. Putin positioned his dreaded Black Sea fleet in the waterway, with his goal being to use his warships to pelt southern Ukraine and provide logistical support to his soldiers by way of occupied Crimea. Only things haven't gone to plan for Putin. About a third of the Black Sea fleet is now destroyed, with the rest withdrawing to the point where Putin's navy is practically a non-factor in terms of causing any serious damage to Ukraine. As the Telegraph columnist Tom Sharp puts it, the Russians defeated in the naval sphere by the Ukrainians would appear to have more to gain from a ceasefire in the Black Sea. Russia has already lost that particular fight, but by offering up a ceasefire there, Putin is trying to create the illusion of progress toward a full ceasefire or eventual peace without actually offering anything. It's all part of Putin's trickery. And why is Vladimir playing these tricks? He doesn't want the Ukraine war to end. For one thing, he can't afford the war to end. Russia is so dependent on the military-industrial complex Putin has created that ending the war now will plunge the country into an economic black hole. It would also mean hundreds of thousands of soldiers come flooding back into Russia. That's a problem in its own right. As Medusa points out, those returning soldiers have earned thousands of dollars more in Russia's military than they ever will in regular jobs back home. Many will turn to crime or other uses of the violence they've learned on the front lines rather than try to find new jobs. Even those who do look for gainful employment when they're back home will find it difficult to get anywhere. Outside of the defense industry, job openings in Russia fell by 15% in the first 2 months of 2025 compared to the same period in 2024. There aren't enough jobs to go around, as evidenced by Russia's low 2.4% unemployment rate, and the sudden return of an army that's no longer needed will only compound the problem. Putin is also playing his blackmail and delaying tactics because he thinks he holds all of the cards. His military is making gains in Ukraine, albeit slow ones, and he's gradually pushing Ukraine's invading forces out of Kursk. He knows that Russia can fight on for at least a few more months while stringing Trump along without absorbing any additional pain. Blackmail now may make the months that follow much easier for Russia, and if Putin manages to get what he wants, he's giving up fighting in a sea where he's already lost in return for sanctions being lifted, resulting in more money flowing into his country. But what it may all really come down to is the root cause of the Ukraine problem. In Putin's eyes, the root cause is simple. He doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist at all. It is, and has always been, part of the Russian Federation, with Putin believing this idea so fervently that he refers to Ukrainians and Russians as one people. That tells you why he's broken so many ceasefires with Ukraine in the past, and why he's preparing to do the same in the Black Sea. Nothing less than the complete destruction of Ukraine as a sovereign nation is good enough for Putin. Zelenskyy will likely hope that Trump is aware of that fact and will play his own version of negotiating hardball now that he's faced directly with Putin's tactics. The question now is simple. How will Trump respond to Putin's Black Sea ceasefire demands? Let us know what you think the answer might be, along with telling us where, if anywhere, you think all of these ceasefire negotiations will go. And remember to subscribe to the Military Show for the latest news about the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. We're an independent source of up-to-date information about military conflicts around the globe, and we very much appreciate your support.